Everybody. Welcome to SAIS, and a special welcome to our guest today, Elizabeth Shackelford, the author of The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, a book which has just won the Douglas Dillon Award of the American Academy of Diplomacy, of which I'm a member. I am Eric Edelman. I am a practitioner in residence here at SAIS, and I'm happy to have Lizzie join us today to talk about her new book. She is a graduate of Duke University and of the University of Pittsburgh Law School. She spent about 10 years working in international development for Booz Allen and others. She spent almost a decade in the Foreign Service in garden spots like South Sudan and Somalia, and has a very interesting story to tell about her time in South Sudan. So Lizzie, welcome. And let me just say that, we do not have really a tradition in the American diplomatic service of resignation and protest. You did do that in late 2017, and your letter of resignation went viral. Tell us a little bit about what led you to that, what led you to use the Dissent Channel, which is the internal State Department mechanism for officers to register their dissent from official policy. And what led you to your resignation? What led you to write the book?
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Edelman. It's great to be here. I'm really thrilled to be here with this audience today and with you to have this conversation. Yeah, I'll just start by saying, obviously I have a history of finding different ways to push back against the status quo, and sometimes there are easier ways to do that than others. While I was in the Foreign Service, I used whatever tools were available to me because I felt strongly that the State Department didn't always welcome contrary opinions to whatever the prevailing policies were. And we do have some tools to use to do that. And as you know, the book that I wrote, The Dissent Channel, it's about kind of what transpired during my second tour. So I was quite junior. And as you know from being in the service yourself, junior officers like myself sometimes think we know an awful lot. But we can often bring a different perspective to the table, and you just want it to be part of the conversation. So I spent a year in South Sudan, and while I was there, what I discuss in the book is, I kind of grew from being in a position where I thought, we were in this new country with all this great opportunity to help it grow into this thriving democracy. And needless to say, the mud was washed away from my eyes fairly early on in my time there. And over that period of time, I questioned my own views about what was going on and what our role, the American role, was in South Sudan, whether it was positive or negative, and how we might change it. And by the time I finished up in a year there and saw a civil war break out and get worse and worse, it wasn't me alone. I had others who were similarly kind of, worker bees. And we had some opinions about what we could have done to, if not stop the violence, at least reduce it and reduce our kind of contributing role there. So that's when I decided to use the Dissent Channel as a mechanism to kind of formally voice those views and those contrary opinions. And for those who don't know a lot about, we can talk specifically about what the Dissent Channel is as well. But that was a mechanism I used at a time when I still believed strongly that the best thing I could do was try and change things from the inside. And fast forward a few years later, and I came to a point where I felt no longer that I was in a position to change things from the inside. This has been a big discussion point for people who are in the service, in the federal government generally, over the past several years, and people who have left. The question of, should you stay and try and do change from the inside, or should you leave? And when I ultimately came to the decision to resign, it was because I felt that the path to pushing for change had really closed for me, because I no longer had the same goals as our leadership in the government and in the State Department. So that was the difference between trying to use the tools available on the inside and actually resigning. And to this day, I've seen a lot of my former colleagues have that same struggle.
I'm going to engage Lizzie in a conversation now. It's not going to be an interrogation, although it might look like that at some points. But for those of you in the audience, when we get to the question and answer period, please, you can start now populating the Q&A function on Zoom with your questions, and we'll get to those in a couple of minutes, and particularly if you want to know more about the Dissent Channel and how it's used. I'm sure Lizzie would be happy to describe her experience there. So Lizzie, let me pick up where you were discussing, as you do in the book, your experience in South Sudan. And much of what you describe to me as a 30-year veteran of the Foreign Service sounds very, very familiar, which is the tendency of ambassadors and embassy staffs to sort of polish off the sharp points in the bilateral relationship between the United States and the host country. And it's frequently couched in terms of preserving our access, preserving our influence. Let's not criticize them too much in the human rights report. And just so the audience understands, part of Lizzie's responsibilities in Juba were as the human rights officer. And this normally goes by the rubric of clientitis. And it happens not just in the embassy in South Sudan, it happens virtually at every embassy. How do you fight that? How do you militate against clientitis when you have to also balance the questions of influence and access and executing the multitude of interests that the United States has in any given country?
That is, at the core, one of the biggest challenges that I think we have in a lot of our bilateral relationships. I think that there is this sense that, from the outside, that the American government has, tremendous influence, particularly on countries like South Sudan. I mean, South Sudan, survived for a long time off of a lot of aid and assistance from the United States and other countries. So, you get the view from the outside that we should be able to, to really direct things to go the way that we'd like. And that's not really how, that's certainly not how it works, particularly in places with a kind of long colonial legacy where there is, there's a tendency on both sides to be very cautious about kind of reasserting a colonial type of relationship, right? There's a sense of independence in a country like South Sudan where you do not want to be dictated to by the foreigners from overseas who give you money. And I think that that's a very good point. But for me, one of the ways that we could better balance that is frankly just honesty and incrementally using it along the way. I think one of our challenges, this is honesty with our partners, like the government of South Sudan, and with ourselves. And I think that we have a big challenge to face in wanting to believe that things are going in the direction that we want them to. And this is a challenge for a couple of reasons. One, because in challenging places like South Sudan, you don't have people who are there for that long. You don't want to be the ambassador who's holding the bag when a country falls apart. So you want to kind of continue pushing it along. You don't want to be the person who says, actually, we should reduce our assistance to this country and reduce our relationship because it's not going well. People don't get promoted for shutting down opportunities in new countries, So part of it is just the approach that we take. But I do think that there's also a very, South Sudan in many ways reflects our relationship with a lot of countries, but in some ways it is unique in that the United States played a very big role in South Sudan taking the path to independence. Many people say that we midwifed the country because politically speaking, it's questionable whether or not the country would have been able to pursue that path without us. And so there was just so much need for it to succeed that at those stages early on, when perhaps we could have been more critical and pushed more for more positive action, before we got so far along, the smaller steps would have been both more effective in calling them out on human rights issues and might also have built our own credibility. By the time we were a couple of months out from war beginning, we had frequently said to the government, you really shouldn't do that. Your security forces shouldn't do that, or there will be consequences. And for years, there were no consequences, none whatsoever. We continued to provide the assistance that was on the table. So I think, showing that there was some real meaning behind our interests in the country and that we were willing to stand behind them earlier, before the costs of kind of pulling out and reducing our assistance would have been so huge. I think that that's when we need to start being more honest up front, both with ourselves and the other country.
I want to stay on the point of being honest with ourselves, because I think actually that is one of the biggest challenges we face, and particularly in dealing with clientism. I mean, I had this experience myself when I was U.S. ambassador to Turkey, and I see it continuing to play out in the U.S.-Turkish relationship, right? Because we continue to basically operate on two premises with Turkey. One is uh, if we treat it like an ally, it'll act like an ally, and no matter what they do, we'll just keep treating them like an ally. And the other is Turkey is so significant and so important, it's too big to fail. And no matter how much we fail in, in actually managing the relationship with Turkey, that those two postulates just seem to be not falsifiable by any experience. And what you were describing in the book about your experience in Sudan resonated with me, but you suggest that South Sudan was really pretty far from America's major strategic interests, and therefore it was hard to get Washington's attention. So how could you do that? I mean, had you been the ambassador rather than the human rights officer, how would you have gone about getting Washington's attention to a place that not too many people in Washington typically pay attention to? It wasn't hard for me when I was in Turkey, but obviously harder in some place like South Sudan.
The really curious part about South Sudan is that, I mean, it had, for an African country in particular, a tremendous amount of interest out of Washington. The interest was in supporting it and kind of showcasing it as this success story for us, but not in doing kind of the hard work that would have been required to help shape a better future, or in kind of admitting the mistakes that we had made along the way that had contributed to the situation. So, one of the reasons I was so interested in South Sudan was, okay, South Sudan is not strategically important to the United States. So because it is of such low strategic interest, isn't this a place where we could make the right decisions and the right calls, rather than having to sacrifice a lot of calls to greater strategic interests? One of the things that I think I did not understand sufficiently at the time, and I grew to learn, and you see me getting a better understanding of this in the book as well, is that it was less about our relationship with South Sudan than about our relationship with other countries in the region. We weren't willing to play hardball with Uganda, for example, over Uganda's finagling in South Sudan, which really did help propel the beginning of this war, because we had other interests with Uganda, because we were more concerned with Uganda's partnership in Somalia. And so these are the types of things which make it, on the one hand, I do think that Washington needs to listen more to the messages coming from the field, because they are often, we often saw this. We had a lot of, we had different political appointees and kind of lifetime South Sudan and Sudan folks who were, in the special envoy's office or in the White House. And they didn't seem to appreciate the insights that we had from the ground, because they've been following this for a long time. So on the one hand, I did feel like they should be listening more to what's happening present day, and kind of your image of South Sudan from 5 years ago is not reflecting what we're seeing on the ground. But at the same time, you have to balance that with, well, Washington sees the bigger picture outside that country. And it gets back to, so what should we have done and what could we have done? And I do think that it's harder to say from the field. It's harder to say from Juba. We need to play hardball with Uganda. We need to talk Kenya and Ethiopia into pushing with their partners in the region for better outcomes and better behavior by the government. But on reflection, because of our bigger strategic interests in the region, if you're looking at the short term, yes, we need to prioritize other things. But if you're looking at a longer term picture, and this is a fundamental issue with our foreign policy, ensuring that different neighboring countries aren't helping to destabilize the country that this mission is in. The longer term interest is not necessarily in the picture that Washington is looking at there. So I think when you look at what I would have done as an ambassador in South Sudan at the time, was raise more alarm with Washington. But on the ground, when we're putting out statements, this all sounds small, these little diplomatic things. When you put out statements about violence, call out who's committing the violence. When you're talking one-on-one, when you're making decisions about which assistance we continue, there are a lot of different ways along the way that the mission can influence that. and can influence, where our red lines are drawn. But most importantly with that, and this is something that the ambassador and the country doesn't have control over, when we say there will be consequences, there need to be consequences. And that's a place where we frequently fell short between the mission in Juba and Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and not just in South Sudan, it happens elsewhere. I mean, some of this is playing out, a similar kinds of situation, it seems to me, is playing out even as we speak today in Ethiopia, with Abiy's dispatch of forces to Tigray and the danger that represents. So, again, this is not what you're describing is not a one-off, that we face these kinds of challenges constantly. So, one of the things that struck me as I read your account of this is that in some sense, you were describing a strategy towards managing the relationship with South Sudan that someone might, when looking at it, as say was, more transactional, which is to say, if you don't stop X, we will stop giving you Y. Yet at the end of the book, when you describe your resignation, one of the things you talk about is President Trump's transactionalism in international affairs. So how would you draw the distinction between the two?
It's a really interesting way of looking at, which I hadn't before, but you're right. I mean, suggesting that if you don't do X, we do Y, it does sound transactional, but if you put it in a much bigger picture of, we should not be doing the types of things and providing the types of assistance in a country that perpetuate aspects that are undermining our long-term interest in a region, right? So we should not be providing, and a great example in South Sudan and in many of these other countries, we should not be providing military assistance to a military that continues to commit human rights abuses that undermine stability in a particular country or region. For me, it is less about saying we should be cutting this back as a punishment to you. It's more about we should not be providing it if it is contributing to long-term bad acts. So you do have to be careful about how you address this. But in South Sudan, the case was very clear. The security services were committing abuses against civilians based on ethnicity by the time the war broke out. In that kind of scenario, you need to, you need to be honest about why are we providing this assistance and what are the implications of that assistance. So, I mean, transactional, I do think, I guess it'd be less to say we shouldn't be transactional and more, we should be long-term strategic. And it should be based on what is in our national interests. And I think in a place like South Sudan, we need to be honest with ourselves about what those interests to the American people are. Is there an interest in a country like South Sudan being stable, being able to address and be resilient against, humanitarian disasters, against climate change and matters like that? Yes. Is it necessary that it not become a place that, that is a breeding ground for violent extremism? Yes. But if what we're doing is based on these very short-term interests of we're trying to get to the next election without having a failure on our hands, we need to be cautious about continuing the types of assistance that just make it look as though we're able to maintain that level of influence. And that influence question is another one that we should get to, because the question is, if in a place like South Sudan, with providing the type of money and assistance that we have for a long time, if we're not able to influence their decline into civil war, what are we preserving that for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question on influence for what? But it's an interesting question about this, because I think one of the things that I experienced in my career, and I suspect you did the same thing, is that the seemingly weak partner to the United States has disproportionate ability to influence the course of the bilateral relationship. And that's for, I think, a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that the weak ally, in this case, the government of South Sudan, totally pretty much dependent on the largesse of the international community, notably including the United States, basically always holds the ultimate threat over the international community. Let me do what I want, or I will roll over and die. And you don't want my death on your conscience, or have to answer for it. And it's compounded by the fact that the mean, you were talking about the importance of having a long-term strategic view, and I completely agree with that. Problem is, the State Department, in my experience, is one of the most astrategic institutions, on the planet. And part of the reason for that is that you adverted to this in your introductory comments, Lizzie, which is that the incentives system in the incentive system is not geared towards the long-term perspective. It's geared towards the rating period. It's geared towards your tour. And while it's, theoretically important to think about where's South Sudan going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, where's Turkey going to be 5, 10, 15 years? I mean, I'm still dining out on Turkey, but for most ambassadors, for most senior officials in an embassy, basically, if it's not on my watch, it's not my problem, and I don't want this, to go back to my first point, I don't want the client to die on me because I don't want there to be a accountability review board and a malpractice case brought against me. So how do you deal with those two factors?
I think that's a really great question, and it's something that structurally the State Department. I mean, you've got a lot of folks looking at let's say we have an opportunity to rebuild the State Department. There's a real need. Fundamentally, the boring HR things are going to need to be addressed. Like, what is the basis on which people get promoted? Matters like the corridor reputation. So for people who aren't familiar with the State Department, so much of your career hinges on your corridor reputation, which is just your hallway reputation, like in any organization. And if you have a reputation for being a troublemaker or difficult, that can really impact your ability to get promotions and better jobs and things like that. So the culture of the State Department tends to encourage and promote much more conservative action, and it doesn't really promote or encourage people to take political risks or policy risks. And policy risks are often the types of things that that we need to be doing in order to reorient us. Most of the time, politically, it is much easier for us to stay on whatever path we're on with a particular country or region. Unless things fall apart externally, there's not a lot of incentive, whether it's from the White House or the State Department or the mission, for people to try and reorient that. It's particularly hard if you're in a place like South Sudan that's unaccompanied. Most people are there for a year. How do you have somebody go there and even know enough to make big assumptions of how we can try and shift things? So I think it's going to take a major rethink at the State Department, and it might involve whether it's you have things like the American Foreign Service Association offering things like the Dissent Channel Award. I think it's important to have incentives that publicly show that we are encouraging people to think outside the box and try and find ways to find resolution to long-standing problems that were there before your tour began and will be there after your tour ends, unless somebody tries to tackle it. We need to have a culture that doesn't discourage people from failure, because frankly, if you try something that's risky, you might fail. But we're not going to correct some of our fundamentally challenged relationships in the world unless we try things that are new. I think that there is more tolerance for that in some ways, kind of on the military side of the shop, because there's this assumption that there are greater risks with military action. But I think we need to be willing to be a little riskier with our diplomatic actions too, and to put and to give the missions that are out in the field and our career people who are going to be watching some of these problems for a much longer period of time, to give them more of a seat at the table. But over the past few administrations, the number of political appointees has really exploded, and it's become harder and harder for your career people to have a meaningful part of the policy conversation. So I think that has an impact too.
Yeah, let me, I wanted to give you an opportunity to actually talk a little bit more about the Dissent Channel and what it was set up to do and when and all that. But the point you just made, I think, is important. So how do you, given the fact that, at least in our system, the national interest is essentially mediated through an elected political leadership that makes a determination about what the national interest is. How do you maintain a kind of disciplined diplomatic service that has to execute, national policy, whether you agree with it or not? And you make a great point at some point in the book, you talk about sitting in on the country team meeting in Kenya, which suddenly made you realize how, incredibly vast the apparatus is that for some of these major posts where we've got, 1,500 people total and all the rest of it, and you got so many different policy matters going on. I mean, obviously, none of us in the Foreign Service agree with all of U.S. policies on every issue all of the time. So you made the point that things got to the point for you where the fundamental direction of American foreign policy is so antithetical to your own views and values that you resigned. I mean, in my day, there were a number, I think 17 of my colleagues resigned over Bosnia back in the 1990s. Obviously, several people resigned over the Iraq War in the early 2000s. But how do you maintain a disciplined service and also, carry out policies that are inevitably going to be controversial, and it's always controversial. So whether it's a Trump administration or Biden administration, or whether there'd been a Clinton administration, some of these policies from somebody's point of view would have been controversial. So how do you balance that?
I think one way that you do it is to look at for me, my personal example, you could look at the reasons that I did not resign under the Obama administrations, and then I did choose to resign under the Trump administration. And one was that even though I did not feel like I was pushing the needle forward, particularly where I was under the Obama administration years, I still felt like there were avenues of conversation and discussion. I didn't feel like there were enough. But it was such a dramatic difference between then and what I saw in the first year of the Trump administration and what many of my colleagues saw, that it really kind of highlighted to me, the importance of having the discussion points and having the opportunities to raise your concern. Career people understand that they are the apoliticals and that political leaders, run the direction. They get that. You saw that for decades. Many people see that. So I think that it is enough sometimes to feel, and you see this in different chapters in the book. I frequently butted heads with our front office in the mission, but I did feel as though my ambassador, my DCM, they sat me down and they listened, and they said, we get this. For these reasons, we're not going to do this time. But I felt like I had an opportunity to voice those concerns. The Dissent Channel process, right? This is the formal tool by which the State Department, and you don't see this in many organizations, it is a formal mechanism that says you can file this. It goes to the Secretary's office. It goes to these different offices, and they are required under the regulations to give you a written response. So it's a great idea. The way the tool works in action, though, really, they kind of like tidily wrap it up, and you can't share it with anybody, and they put it away, and they're like, you've done your thing, go forward. But I think you could take that as a basis for a model, and actually go back to what I've heard from a number of people since I left the State Department, since my book came out. Actually, some former State Department personnel from back in the 70s reached out to say, did you know that there was this whole forum mechanism where they got together and had discussions and luncheons to talk about some of these dissent topics. I think that there are, again, they sound kind of boring and bureaucratic and human relations related, but I think you can create the foundation and the environment that fosters more discussion. And then even if things don't go your way when you are the idealistic young human rights officer, you feel like you're able to, first of all, get your opinions out there, which is helpful, and also have an opportunity to hear why that doesn't work at this time. So I think we need to really look at how we create a broader conversation, and how, even as we have a lot of politicals in, that there is a respect and an engagement between the politicals and the career people at the State Department to ensure that those views aren't getting dismissed. And I think if you look at the last 4 years, you've seen a really outright dismissal of the career views and just a distrust. And I think that will certainly not foster a healthy conversation moving forward.
No, I agree. Totally unhealthy, actually. But my own view, for what it's worth, is that for the and I used to say this because having twice had to deal with the Armed Services Committee, where when you're confirmed, you actually have to sign a form that says, if you come before this committee as Undersecretary for Policy, as I was at the time, you have to give us your best, defense policy view, regardless of whether or not it agrees with, U.S. policy. And I actually went to Secretary Gates's front office towards the end in 2008 on this particular subject, which need not detain us here, and said, I can't testify about this unless you want me to say what I really think, which is not what, the administration policy is. But on the Dissent Channel, could you talk a little bit more about what you felt about the dissent cable that was leaked? Because you write about this. I mean, you had done your own dissent, but you actually saw problems with the Dissent Channel cable that got so much attention about the travel ban. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that the tool of the Dissent Channel tool, the mechanism, it's certainly not working out ideally now. And I understand why several dissents have been leaked to the press. They've been leaked because people feel as though they are pushing these dissents up the chain to a place where they know they will get no consideration.
Because they're supposed to go to the policy planning staff, the Secretary's policy planning staff, which is supposed to provide a response on behalf of the Secretary.
Yes, and I'm certain they went to that office, but I'm certain that nobody who was staffing that office in the past several years was, opening those dissents and reading them and saying, yes, we should consider this. Now, it is an open question as to whether or not when I submitted my dissent to the Secretary's policy planning office, that whether they thought, let's really consider this. I have my doubts. I think that our policy was quite baked at that point.
And just to be clear, this was in the Obama administration, not the Trump.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. As my co-author on the dissent wrote to me in an email later, he said, well, it's not like they've ever received one of these and thought, you're right, we're getting it all wrong, we're going to change policy today. I mean, that's not going to happen. We understand that. But there is a different sense when you know that the staff in that office is determined not to allow the deep state to get in its way of the policies of what it's doing. And that has been the sentiment over the past few years. But if you want a healthy, functioning, wide-ranging conversation over policy issues, policy concerns, and dissents to the prevailing policy at issue, you have to have a system that is kind of intact and going to promote an open and honest conversation. And by leaking a dissent, you're basically you're violating what that tool is meant to be. And in the case of the ones that leaked during the Trump administration, it of course just fed into the sense that the State Department career personnel are all deep staters who are out to get the administration. The idea that you would leak it to the press, that someone would leak it to the press, is just affirming the idea that they're against the administration. But for me, the only way that tool or mechanism would work is if it does open an internal, honest discussion. And I think that requires having trust between the politicals and the career folks, and having an openness to hearing other views.
Just for the record, I have to say that the term deep state actually originated in Turkey and to some degree in Pakistan. And having been the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and having watched the deep state in action, I can assure you that we do not have a deep state in the United States. I want to move on to a couple of other questions, including we've touched on the reform of the State Department question. I want to dig into that a little bit more. So there have been no shortage of prescriptions about this. I mean, a year ago, the American Academy, which awarded you the Dillon Award, had a report about making the State Department more effective. And in recent weeks, I think in anticipation of what people hoped would be a much larger Biden victory than what appears to be happening electorally in the last couple of days. But former Deputy Secretary Bill Burns and Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield have had an article in Foreign Affairs, and my UVA colleague and occasional co-author Philip Zelikow has had an article in Foreign Policy. A lot of these prescriptions for reform of the State Department, first of all, none of them are new, really, although Philip has a few interesting, quirky ideas, as he always does. But a lot of it tracks with some of what you write about in the book. I mean, you write about the just decrepit state of our diplomatic platform And of course, in Juba and in Mogadishu, I mean, you were, dealing with, shipping containers rather than actual buildings. But, having spent some time in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow as the new embassy was being built, I mean, the disrepair of the embassy was really shocking. And I always made it a point, actually, to try and bring congressional delegations down into our workspaces so that they could actually, which the front office didn't like, by the way, just so they could see what, how their representatives overseas were working, how the representatives of the other superpower were, were working. So a lot of these, I mean, Bill and Linda talk about a diplomatic surge and more personnel and essentially more stable and predictable and higher levels of funding, for the State Department and for foreign affairs generally. How do you get there politically? I mean, I was just looking at an exit poll from Virginia, so not necessarily reflective of the entire United States. On the other hand, Virginia has a very large population of, federal employees. Foreign policy was a matter of concern to 1% of the electorate in the recent election. So how do you, build a constituency for that kind of surge to provide more personnel and more funding for state?
There are a lot of different reasons why the State Department doesn't have the kind of constituency that you have for our military or even our intelligence services. I'll go with the most fun answer there, which is that the State Department, unlike the CIA or the Pentagon, does not have an office in Hollywood. I think that it would be very helpful if the State Department did a little bit of effort to promote ourselves out there, because diplomacy is not boring. I have been on so many different panels and discussions with people where they talk,
have you sold the movie rights to the book yet?
I have not, but I'm telling you, read my book. Diplomacy is pretty exciting, I think. So part of it is just that the American people don't know what we do. They have a sense of what our military does. They know and they believe strongly in the importance of our military to our national security, which is interesting because I think that your average American believes they have a far greater sense of what we do. If you flash back a few years ago when there was the attack in Niger that killed 4 American service members, people were like, we're in Niger? Like, our soldiers, like, that was in Afghanistan? People don't know where all we are, kind of prosecuting wars around the world. So I think if we did a better job, and by we, I think in that case, it would need to be, both through Congress, through think tanks, through our military, but publicizing more about what the different foreign policy branches of the United States government are doing. There could be both a greater skepticism over the utility to our national interest of a lot of our military activity around the world. The simple question of what is in the, what are Americans in the middle of the country getting out of our counterterrorism operations in dozens of countries across the globe. But we need to make the case to the American people that diplomacy is important. There's a law that was off the books a few years ago, repealed a few years ago, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but it basically prohibited the State Department from doing any propaganda in the homeland. And that's one of the reasons that the United States that the State Department doesn't have kind of a pattern and a history of really doing a lot of promotion of what we do at home. It's this idea that we cannot
Smith-Zarinsky.
Yes, exactly. So I think that has, it's interesting. So few Americans know about it, but it's always in the back of the minds of foreign service officers that, like, we can't do that. So I think there needs to be a fresh look at how we can promote what the State Department does back here. But I also think that fundamentally, we are going to have to build a State Department that is able to bring more and deliver more to the American people. Because what we've seen in the last generation, during this whole global war on terror years, is that, at first we went to the military because the military had the resources that the State Department didn't have. And then the State Department didn't get any more resources because it wasn't doing that and the military was. So it just became this cycle of giving more and more of the foreign policy universe of what we do overseas to the military, and it's just reinforced itself. So part of that is that the State Department's going to have to be in a position and resourced enough so that it can do that. And the way I see that playing out kind of politically is really this kind of growing, there's a growing community in the foreign policy world that's pushing back against our huge defense budget and our endless wars. And I think that that's starting to share that information more with the American people about the things that we can't afford at home because we rely so much on the military is a start to doing that. It's going to require more money to the State Department. It's going to require more people, but that's not going to be enough. You're going to have to actually empower the State Department to take over more of this and explain to the American people how that is better bang for your buck. I guess bang isn't the right word, but you know what I mean.
But when you say take over more of this, what is the this that you have in mind?
So a good example is, I mean, not that we want to go back to a world of nation building by our government, but Somalia provides a very good example to me of how much the military has really taken over other non-traditionally, kind of non-war areas of our foreign policy. AFRICOM was established how many years ago now? 8-9 years ago. The latest U.S. combatant command, and AFRICOM was created to be kind of a combined.
It was back in 2008 when they
2008
when they amended the Uniform Command Plan.
Where years are just passing so much faster than I thought. So AFRICOM, the idea was, back, we've got this whole idea of the 3Ds, development, diplomacy, and defense working together, and AFRICOM was supposed to be a great example of that in force. But instead, what you see in places like Somalia is that our diplomats are behind walls without permissions to go anywhere, without the resources to do it. So you have the AFRICOM establishing its kind of civilian core efforts that are out there in communities doing things that USAID should be doing, working on stability matters, working with local communities, having, I still remember when I was in the ambassador's office back in the US mission, when we had a whole team of AFRICOM folks come in to give us their analysis on the Somali elections. And I was like, why are you guys doing an analysis of the Somali elections? There are 5 of you. You've been working on this for 3 months. That's my job. I'm a diplomat. Why don't y'all go back to war making? But their access and resources and ability to invest in addressing those things is it's far greater than ours because of resources.
So let me push you a little bit on that, because it's one of the areas where I think we might have some disagreement. So I get the point that state needs more money. I've always advocated that. The notion, however, that if we cut the defense budget, some of that money would go to state, I think is actually, belied by the actual authorization and appropriation process. I mean, state is not in the the 050 account. It's got its own 150 account, the international affairs account, and its budget is set by committees that consider it, along with the Department of Commerce, which has a huge domestic constituency in the business community, and the Department of Labor, which has its own constituency. As long as you're part of that bill, for funding as a State Department, why would anyone believe that you're going to get more money?
I mean, that's a fair point. And I certainly don't see us getting, you take a chunk from the Pentagon and you take it over to Foggy Bottom. That's certainly not how it's going to work, which is one of the reasons that this is not a short-term, near-term fix. I mean, you're going to have to persuade a lot of folks in Congress to find that new funding mechanism and to really invest in it, which is why, again, this is not a matter of if you throw more money and add more slots for the incoming foreign service classes. That's not going to be enough. You need to change the perception in Washington, at the White House and on the Hill, of how much we actually value diplomacy. So it's not a short term, if we just added some more funding here, it's going to be an issue. It's going to be a matter of really deciding that you're going to invest in putting the civilian side of foreign policy at the front. These things are connected, right? It is connected that the State Department needs more resources, and that we do need to. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I don't necessarily think that we need to take money from the Defense Department. There might be other things for these global threats that we're facing: a pandemic, future potential pandemics, climate change, where the Defense Department has a big role to play. What I don't think that we need to be doing is continuing to fight a lot of unmonitored unaccountable small wars around the world. And that's where I think we've gotten to the point in so many countries where we have military activity, where the Pentagon is taking the lead in our entire bilateral relationship because its seat at the table in the White House and in our overall interagency has just dwarfed the State Department. And how we like funding is a big reflection on how we prioritize things. So that is really just, it exemplifies where the priorities are.
I have a long list of questions, but I want to go to the Q&A. I think probably you and I could go on for several hours in this conversation.
Yes.
One of the questions was, how do we rebalance after the militarization of diplomacy we've seen over the last 20 years? I think we've actually pretty much covered that. One question, one of our audience members asked, how you were talking about the atrocities committed by the SPLA. How did these militaries get assistance given the requirements of the Leahy Act, for standards of human rights on militaries that receive U.S. assistance, including some of the things you talk about like IMET and whatnot?
That's a really great question. And the simple answer is that Leahy prohibitions on funding through and assistance through the Leahy law is based on us having documented evidence of those atrocities. So you have to know which command units, which commanders, which specific aspects of the military and which specific groups have committed atrocities, and you have to document it. Which gets us back to the fact that the only person trying to provide that was the human rights officer who had 2 other jobs in the embassy. And you simply don't have the ability. So this is another one of the things that a reinforced and more effective State Department could really address, which is helping us have our military assistance be more accountable if we had more robust ability to track down and document human rights abuses.
I was going to ask you one of the other recommendations that Bill Burns and Linda Greenfield make, but also covered by the American Academy report, is the issue of diversity and making the Foreign Service look more like America, which is something I think most of us believe is necessary. One of our questioners asked, how do you make the Foreign Service entry process more equitable? And how do we do that? I mean, this is not a new issue for the Foreign Service. For the entire time I was in the Foreign Service, which was 30 years, we were operating under consent decrees with lawsuits brought first by women Foreign Service officers, then by African-American Foreign Service officers. There was a similar effort with regard to Hispanic Foreign Service officers. Yet the Foreign Service remains overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. What explains that, and what can we do to make it more diverse?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that, back in the kind of Diplomacy 3.0 days, when there was a big hiring surge under Hillary Clinton, they were actually doing a really great job. My incoming class was very diversity of backgrounds, diversity. We had a high percentage of women and people of color. So I think that you can simply go back to some of what we were doing and bring people in. I think that the fellowship programs are really essential, that bring people in from a far wider variety of universities.
You mean like
we have to
look
look
at Pickering Fellows?
Exactly. Yeah. So you have to go and look, right? Like, I was born and raised in Mississippi, so I kind of have a sense, right? I'm not one of those Beltway kids who knew about the Foreign Service growing up. So you have to do outreach across the country to make sure that people who represent all aspects of America know that this is even an option that's open to them. I think we have to be really careful about some of the requirements that we have. One of the issues in the Burns and Thomas Greenfield piece was talking about how there needs to be more reliance on your resume instead of the oral interview and the written parts. But I actually think that that's a big risk, because so many people who get their international experience have the benefit of doing that because their parents can pay for them to do unpaid internships overseas. We have to stop having that be a barrier for entry, to have that kind of international experience, because not everybody has that. But more critical to me is not bringing people in. We can bring more people in. It's how we keep diversity through the ranks going up. So we've got to find ways to better address the bias in the promotion system and in the assignment system. Foreign Service officers and State Department personnel are like humans everywhere. We glom onto the people who have similar experience in lives as us. So you have to have some affirmative actions to prevent against that. I mentioned earlier tonight the corridor reputation, which is just your reputation in the department. And you do see people, when you know who's on when you're in a promotion panel and you kind of, you don't really have blind promotion, whether it's by gender or other aspects of people's personality. So you do see higher rates of promotion of white men. It's been a consistent problem in the State Department. So they need to find ways to address those kind of bureaucratic HR issues that help our implicit bias come in. And we've just got to be more deliberate about it. We really have to make it a goal. In the Burns and Thomas Greenfield piece, they talked about having a hard date by 2030 of having some specific requirements of what our foreign service looks like at the different ranks. And I think it might be painful to work it through in the near term, but I think without doing it deliberately, it's not going to happen. We've proven that.
We have another question, Lizzie, which is, do you think a Biden administration, and our questioner is perhaps jumping the gun a little bit, but it does look like we're going to have a Biden administration. Will they be able to address the issues that Bill and Linda raise in their article about low morale, political appointees, politicization of the institution, and et cetera? I mean, after the impact of Secretaries Tillerson and Pompeo, which it was hard to believe we could have a worse secretary than Rex Tillerson, but Mike Pompeo has risen to the challenge. How much of the damage do you think can be remediated by a Biden administration?
I absolutely think the damage can be remediated. The question is will it be? And there are a few obstacles standing in our way. One is that the Biden administration, if that is what we end up with, is going to come in with a lot of the same players. And having a lot of the same players who've been in it before, there's going to be a tremendous temptation to go back to the status quo ante and to staff with a lot of political appointees, because that's they have the folks that they want to put in, and I think that's going to be a problem. You've had a lot of
the Biden foreign policy national security apparatus was 2,000 people. That's an awful lot of people chasing a very small number of political jobs in the plum book.
I mean, you're going to see a lot of the same players that we saw under an Obama administration. And one of my personal criticisms of what we saw under the Obama administration was that there was a very high reliance on the National Security Council. There was a very high reliance on political appointees, and there was not nearly as much kind of investment in the career personnel. I said this at the beginning, but the problems that we saw in the last 4 years were not new. They were readily exploited weaknesses in the State Department, and you saw a newness in how extremely they were exploited. But the problems were there to be exploited in the first place. So you're going to have the political will to come in and make some very significant changes. And as we've seen, I mean, as you've already mentioned, we've had several attempts over the past generations to improve these. These problems aren't new. But what we tend to end up with is kind of some mealy-mouthed middle ground consensus where we trim things and fix them around the edges. We add a little bit of funding, and then a couple of years later that goes. So my concern is that we aren't going to have the major changes that we need in our foreign policy. But I am heartened by the fact that over the past 4 years, the only upside to how much the State Department has really been undermined is that this creates that kind of, burning it to the ground, creates an opportunity to rebuild anew, an opportunity that I don't think we've had in the past, because we always just kind of add to, we add new special envoys, we add new offices. New administrations don't tend to take things away and trim around. So I do think that that's an opportunity we have now that we haven't had in the past. It remains to be seen how much it will change, particularly given that we're going to need some assistance from Congress to do so. And if we have a split government, that's going to be even harder.
Would you go into a Biden administration if you were offered a position?
It would have to be a position where I really thought that it could have some meaningful change and really have some meaningful impact. So if it's going to be something that's really going to look the same, I'm not even tempted.
We're running short of time, and you've been great. I thought we might end. We've got almost 30 participants among SAIS students here today. So what, based on your experience that you describe in the book, what would your advice be to them as they're finishing up their graduate studies and considering a career in national security affairs? What would you tell them to look for or try to do?
I would first say there are so many different fascinating ways to be involved in a career in this area. And I've been lucky enough, because I've jumped around as people do more now than they used to do, to have done international development work, diplomacy, and it's a great career path. It's a wonderful way to see the world and to do meaningful work and service to the country. So, you know, had I not left for the reasons that I left, I think I would have been in for a full lifetime career. But you know, my advice is, and I think we've seen how fragile our institutions can be through this past administration. I would highly encourage people who are interested in the foreign service to apply and to go do it. For people who are interested in the government to go do it, we need good people. But I think it's even more important now than ever before to know when you join what your purpose is, what goals you are serving, you know, what you're trying to do in that position for the American people in our country. To have a clear sight of that, so that when we get to a point, as we've seen in the past few years, where you are serving a government that is not necessarily doing what you joined to do, that you've got kind of, you know, a clear moral compass on how you do that. Because one of the biggest risks over the past few years is that people who have given their lives to service to this country have found themselves in positions where they are you know, unintentionally undermining the goals that they've meant to serve. So always have that clear mind. And even when you're young and early and naive, as I was in many ways, at the time that I capture in the book, don't doubt yourself. You know, raise the questions that you have. Don't always assume that the people who have more experience know more than you do, because your perspective is always going to add to the conversation. You know, listen, learn, respect experience, but don't be afraid to speak up, because I think far few people feel that they have the confidence or the experience to speak up. But I think that we all have an important part to contribute to the conversation, whether it's national security or otherwise. So don't be afraid to use your voice.
Lizzie, you've been great. You've been generous with your time. I've been told that in no book, event is complete without holding up a copy of the book. So there is the book, The Dissent Channel. As Lizzie said, it's a great adventure tale. It's a very good read. And I commend it to all of our participants today. And good luck to you on your book tour. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. Good questions from the group. And I hope to engage with you all again soon, maybe in person someday.
We can hope, but it may not be for a while, but we can hope. Thanks very much, Lizzie.